Section 2, Chapter 2. A Professor Meets the SS at Midnight. I want to talk about one of the most remarkable Germans I have ever met. He was a professor of philosophy, but his interests and his knowledge were unusually wide. First, of a scene in his home, then later, in his own words, his interpretation of some of the more fundamental reasons why even intelligent and by no means only unscrupulous young people were caught up in this Nazi movement. I am bound to say I think his comments are among the most penetrating I have heard. It was so easy in Germany as well as in England to shrug one's shoulders in horror at the vulgar and brutal aspects of the movement without realizing that the real tragedy of the revolution in the center of Europe lay in the fact that there were more profound reasons for it than a superficial reading of such aspects would lead one to suspect. Perhaps I should say that the real tragedy lies in the betrayal of a whole generation of youth looking for leadership and eager to serve. But returning to Professor Braun, who, I should add, has a delightfully keen sense of humor, which serves him well in handling situations that throw others into panic or anger. On one or two occasions, Professor Braun had fallen foul of the Gestapo, who suggested that at times he harbored Jewish and other scholars, which I believe was true. I know within 1 month he and his wife had had about 12 visits from Gestapo men, but it so happened the men in the particular district in which his house was situated, in a small town in Silesia, were younger and less brutal than the average. Anyhow, these young SS men could not understand, and in the end could not resist, the goodwill and good humor with which he always met them and even welcomed them. If they arrived in the middle of the afternoon, he would invariably say, "Well, you chaps must choose this time to come because you know it is when we drink coffee. Just decide which room you want to examine while I tell my wife that this afternoon it is coffee and cakes for 4. Or if they arrived at 6 p.m., "Oh, I see the idea. A glass of beer on your way home." At first, the Gestapo men were suspicious and rude to him, refusing all refreshments. But after a number of visits their resistance broke down, largely, I think, because in fact Professor Braun was profoundly interested in them personally. However hostile he might be to the beliefs of the movement and its gangster leaders, he felt somehow partly to blame that intelligent young men should have been ensnared by it. Certainly only the students who knew the professor intimately realized how many young men owed everything to his friendship when the truth about the Nazi party they had joined came home to them. This is the story of one of these. In their earlier visits, it was obvious the SS men did not feel they ought to take that glass of beer with the professor, whose premises they were inspecting. And of course, it's always difficult with 2 Nazis together, because no 2 Nazis dare trust one another. However, one of them said in an aside to the other, "Maybe we'll get him talking." And thus they settled down to the glass of beer. "Herr Professor, why do you oppose our party?" said one of the young men. "Well, you know it has to be that I oppose you because I believe in God," said the professor. "But so does the Führer," came the quick reply. "Does he really?" said the professor. "Well, it's funny how differently it takes different people." Late one night, 2 of them called again, but the professor was as imperturbable as ever. "Look here, this is a bit absurd, both for me to be wakened up at midnight and for you to be working such long hours. I propose, if you call after 11 p.m., you should sleep here. When you have been round the rooms tonight, you will find there is no bed free, but we will stoke up the oven in my study, and you can sleep there if you like. Meanwhile, my wife and I would like to go to sleep now, so if you want something to eat, you know the kitchen, and you must help yourselves. Please leave something for breakfast," he added, "especially if you wish to join us then." The men were rather confused, and explained that they only wished to go round the rooms to see the professor had no strange guests, and that they would be gone in a few minutes. So they were, but a quarter of an hour later, just before 1 a.m., there was another knock, less rude and insistent than usual. Professor Braun wondered momentarily if it could be a fugitive from the Nazis seeking refuge. But as he opened the door, he found it was one of the SS men who had come back. The light from the entrance hall flooded his face as he stood in the darkness on the landing hall of the maisonette. He was pale and obviously distressed as he said, "Herr Professor, after all, may I come for the night? Because I must talk to you, and I have no other opportunity." As 2 and 3 a.m. struck, it must have been a strange sight to see the professor in his dressing gown, sitting back in his chair, smoking a cigar as he sipped his beer, and the young SS man, who had thrown his cap, belt, and revolver on the table, sitting with his service coat unbuttoned and resting his elbows on his knees. He ran his hands through his thick dark hair. He was not the perfect Nordic type. In fact, he came from eastern Silesia and might have had Slav blood in his veins. For nearly 3 hours, Hermann, for that was his name, poured forth a story of bitter disillusionment. "I was unemployed," he said. "No, I didn't go to the university because my father too was unemployed, but I read a great deal and did any odd jobs I could find, and always thought if I studied I might be more likely to get a job, but nothing came. Then I heard about this Nazi party. Many of my friends joined, and I heard the Führer speak, and I was inspired because I believed that he really had something for me to do, and he made us all feel there was something to live for. I still think Germany and the Führer are worth living for. But I did not know that it would be my job to go into the homes of good Germans like you who also want Germany to rise again. You are no enemy of Germany, and I cannot see that it helps anyone never to leave you in peace. But, Herr Professor, there is something worse. I am frightened they will make me go on guard in a concentration camp. They are terrible places, and I could not do it. I know the Jews are the enemies of Germany because the Führer says so, but it is horrible in those camps, and there are not only Jews, but pastors, Social Democrats, and Catholics. One of my friends went on guard there, and in 3 days he committed suicide. It is dreadful down at the headquarters of the SS. So many of the men like to tell revolting stories of torture and all the things they do to Jews and others. If they like doing such things, they must be mad. I cannot, I will not believe that the Führer knows about it. Herr Professor, what can I do? Where can I go? I joined this party because it seemed like a new life opening for me, and now I cannot sleep because I see death everywhere. I am caught in something horrible, and I cannot escape." Just after 6 a.m., the professor's wife wakened to find her husband had never come up to bed at all. So going downstairs, she opened the study door quietly lest she should disturb them if they were both asleep. But she found the professor sitting at his desk writing, for he had not felt he could sleep after that long talk, while his guest, who was huddled up in an armchair, slept feverishly, and might wake and need his company, for he was obviously unnerved. The professor followed his wife into the kitchen, and they discussed what they could do to help Hermann out of the party, or perhaps first onto a different kind of work. It was difficult. There were others in this position, and yet he was only 19 and ought to be helped, because too often the professor had seen how some of them had got over this kind of initial revulsion and later became brutalized and pathological members of the party. "Anyhow," said his wife, "I will get breakfast, for we must get him away early for his own sake." The professor's children were delighted when they were told that breakfast was to be nearly an hour earlier and that they might get up at once. Soon the two eldest came tumbling downstairs and were rather taken aback when they found their guest was an SS man. Although they had never actually seen any trouble in their home, Edward, who was 8 years old, knew enough from his school friends to realize there was often trouble when they came. However, he greeted him in a friendly way, but Liesel, aged 4, a timid little girl, was not so sure and decided to sit on her mother's lap for family prayers, which they always had before breakfast. Liesel never took her eyes off Hermann, for she had all the child's sure instinct for recognizing suffering, and somehow she felt he was very unhappy, and during the singing of the hymn she even suspected he was trying not to cry. As soon as prayers were over, she climbed from her mother's lap, and going across to Hermann, she put her hands on his knees and looking up into his face said, "Warum bist du so traurig? Why are you so sad?" I have mentioned this story of Professor Braun because I wanted to show the kind of man he is before I talk about his teaching, and above all his interpretation of post-war developments in Germany. I wrote him a line before I went to Germany again to say I wanted to speak to him, and asked him to leave a note at my hotel to tell me when we could meet, not just for a chat, but with enough time for him to tell me at leisure why he thought so many students had been caught up in the Nazi movement. I felt that more than most he saw the relation of what had been happening in the universities for a number of years previously to the fanatical devotion of many of the students to the party.